The Apostle Paul was driven to reach idol worshippers with the gospel of Jesus Christ. In 1 Corinthians, he devotes chapters 8, 9, and 10 to correcting pagan beliefs about origins, warning against idolatry and revelry, eating meat sacrificed to idols, and giving up our rights for the sake of former pagans. He warns the Corinthians to flee idolatry. Following this, he launches right into chapter 11 and tells the Corinthians,
"But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God."
Some scholars argue that in this passage, Paul was refuting pagan beliefs about the origins of men and women. In English, the phrase head of often means boss or authority. But these scholars argue that in Bible times, the phrase head of did not mean boss or authority. They believe head of meant origin, source of life, nurture, and provision, like the head of a river is its origin. These scholars believe that Paul was arguing that Christ is the ultimate source of life, not the pagan gods and goddesses, and that he was discouraging the Corinthian church from engaging in head-covering practices that were used to appease and honor gods and goddesses. So let's travel back to the Greco-Roman world and look at some of those pagan beliefs. Ancient peoples believed in many gods and goddesses. The god Zeus reigned over 12 gods and goddesses from the tallest mountain in Greece, Mount Olympus. But where did Zeus and these gods and goddesses come from? The earth goddess Gaia. Before Gaia, there was only primordial matter. All was chaos. Out of this chaos, the goddess Gaia spontaneously formed. She created the sky god to be her consort, and by him she bore many gods and goddesses. But the sky god oppressed her, so her son Kronos castrated him and hurled his genitals into the sea. This caused the sea to foam, and from this foam the goddess Aphrodite emerged fully grown. The Romans called her Venus. But Gaia was the ultimate source of life and the fertility of the land. The Romans worshipped a similar earth goddess whom they called the Magna Mater, the Great Mother. Here's a statue of her. Both Venus and the Magna Mater were very important to the Romans because they believed these two goddesses brought Rome to power and made them the rulers of the world. The Caesars took this even further. Julius Caesar claimed Venus was his ancestor from an affair that she supposedly had with a mortal man. Caesar even created a genealogy to prove it. And when he died, a comet lingered in the sky for days. That comet, people were told, was Venus, carrying Caesar's soul to heaven, where he became a god and ruled the empire from the heavens. The Romans claimed Venus as their mother. They believed Romans were superior to all other people. So, to keep the empire safe and to ensure the fertility of the land, it was necessary to worship the emperor and the Roman gods and goddesses. But only one very important Roman male citizen was permitted to make the sacrifices and perform the liturgy. But first, he and only he must cover his head with a special garment called a toga. No other man dared to cover his head. And in times of crisis, or for very special occasions, women would offer their hair as a sacrifice to Venus. And Venus was the patron goddess of Corinth. A temple to her towered over the city. But if the gods came from the Magna Mater, where did people come from? The Greeks believed that one of the immortal beings, named Prometheus, formed men from clay. And the goddess Athena, she breathed life into the men. But there were no women. But Prometheus felt sorry for the men because they had no fire to keep warm or to cook their food. But fire was where Zeus drew the line between humans and gods. Fire was off limits. Prometheus would have to steal it from the gods, and steal it he did. Zeus was furious. After he punished Prometheus for this brazen deed, he was determined to punish the men. He schemed and connived. At last, he came up with a plan. He would give the men a gift that would be a trap to ensnare the men with perpetual misery. So the gods fashioned an irresistible beauty, a woman. But that's not all. The woman herself was given a gift, a beautiful box. The gods warned her severely.
Never, never, never open this box.
But the devious Zeus gave the woman a massive dose of insatiable curiosity, and it didn't take long before she opened that box. And trapped inside, war, sickness, famine, earthquakes, floods, all the miseries of the world flew out when she opened that box. The poets, philosophers, playwrights, and politicians all bought into this, hook, line, and sinker. The poet Simonides complained.
Zeus designed women as the greatest possible evil and bound men to them with unbreakable chains.
These intellectuals believed women were drastically different from men. They taught that the gods created women from lowly and despised things. According to Simonides, women came from things like
restless waves,
the dirt,
an evil fox,
a dog.
They described women as
inferior, vile,
less honest, cowardly,
with lower intelligence.
Aristotle called women deformed, infertile males. But it doesn't end there. Plato argued being born a woman was a punishment from the gods. He warned,
cowards will be reincarnated as women.
So, if Zeus created women to be the bane of men, what does that say about his view of men? Let's hear it straight from the god himself. In the book The Iliad, he laments.
Men are more wretched than all the creatures that crawl on the earth.
The Iliad and the Odyssey were highly revered writings to the ancient Greeks. These epic poems told the story of the Trojan War. For the heroes in these tales, this war was about the pursuit of glory, the kind of glory you get when you commit a heroic act or vanquish and humiliate your enemy. The Greeks described this kind of glory with the word kleos. Now let's throw the superhero of the Greeks into the mix. We know him as Hercules, but to the Greeks, he was Heracleios, or Heracles. His very name means the glory of Hera. Who is Hera? Zeus's queen. But Zeus was famous for cheating on her, and Hercules was born from one of his many affairs. Hera was so furious she was determined to kill Hercules. She threw everything at him to kill him: lions, monsters, floods, snakes. She even sent him to Hades to capture the vicious three-headed dog that guarded its gates. But Hercules conquered them all. Hera could not kill him, and in the end he attained immortality and glory, kleos, glory. But the Greeks had another word for glory: doxa, glory. Thayer's Bible Dictionary defines doxa as that which evokes good opinion or has inherent worth. So let's review. Zeus was the ruler of all, but the earth goddess Gaia, also called Magna Mater, was the source of life and fertility. The Caesars claimed Venus as their ancestor, and the Romans claimed superiority over everyone else because Venus and the Magna Mater had made them the rulers of the world. Zeus called men wretched and designed women to be a perpetual curse to men. Women were created from lowly and despised things like restless waves or an evil fox. It's to this world that the Apostle Paul addresses his letter to the Corinthians, a world that held a dim view of men and a deplorable view of women. David Hamilton, author of Why Not Women, argues that Paul was refuting pagan beliefs about the origins of men and women when he wrote, "Christ is the head of, or origin, of every man, and man is the head of, or origin, of woman, not the Greco-Roman gods." Hamilton believes Paul was confronting the deplorable belief that Zeus created women from despised and lowly things to be a perpetual curse to men. Paul was arguing that women came from man, which makes her fully equal and valuable to men. But note what Paul did not say. He did not say Christ is the head of man is the head of woman, and God is the head of Christ. He said Christ is the head of every man, and man is the head of woman, and God is the head of Christ. Why does Paul emphasize that Christ is the head of every man? Christopher Gornold Smith, in the YouTube video Unearthed, Corinth in Context, argues that Paul was tearing down the belief in the supremacy of Roman male citizens. Christ is the source of every man. No man can claim supremacy by claiming his origin is from a Roman god or goddess. And, Paul wrote, it's dishonoring to Christ for a man to cover his head when praying or prophesying. In the Roman cults, covering the head before engaging in ritual prayer was to honor the emperor and the Roman gods, but it was the exclusive right of one prominent male Roman citizen. Smith believes Paul was trying to prevent this pagan head-covering practice from being brought into the Corinthian church. No man was permitted to engage in a practice that granted him entitlement over all other men. Paul goes on to say that man is the image of God. Was Paul confronting the dim view of men held by the god Zeus? Was he arguing that just being made in God's image makes men worthy and valuable? Perhaps. We don't know for sure what situation in Corinth he was addressing. And Paul calls men the glory, the doxa, glory of God. Was he taking aim at striving after kleos glory, like the Greek heroes who sought fame by doing heroic deeds? We don't know for sure. Perhaps Paul wanted men to recognize that they carry glory and dignity and worth within them as God's image bearers. But why does Paul say man is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man? Genesis 1:26-27 says both male and female are created in the image of God, and both are commanded to rule over the earth together. Is Paul denying that women are also created in the image of God? David Hamilton, in his book Why Not Women, argues that Paul did not use the Greek word for but. He argues that Paul chose a word that means and also woman is the glory of man. Hamilton believes Paul was tearing down the deplorable belief that women were created to be a perpetual curse to men, and affirming women as equal image bearers of God and as man's glorious partner. But what about the hair and head coverings for women? First, note 5 things. Number 1, the context was a public worship setting in which both men and women are prophesying and praying. Number 2, scholars are not agreed on what a covered head was for a woman. Some argue it meant for a woman to wear her hair bound up on her head. Others argue it meant for her to wear a veil over her hair. 3. Hairstyles and head coverings communicated status. Lower-class women, slaves, and prostitutes were forbidden to cover their heads. 4. There were no words for husband and wife in New Testament Greek. A husband or wife was referred to as one's own man or one's own woman. This passage does not specify one's own man or woman, but some scholars believe Paul was speaking of wives in this passage. That's why some English Bibles translate the word woman as wife. 5. Hair and head coverings were hugely important in the pagan cults. Some cults required women to bind up their hair or to wear a veil, but others expected women to let their hair down and engage in revelry. Enter the god Dionysius. Dionysius was the god of wine and madness. Here he is lounging in a boat. A grapevine snakes its way up the mast, and clusters of grapes hang above the sail. Women worshipped him. His devotees were called Maenads, or mad ones. To honor him, they let down their hair. They ran wild through the woods. They worked themselves into a drunken frenzy and uttered loud, trilling cries. And where did this revelry take place? One ancient writer tells us, on a mountain near the Gulf of Corinth. Worshippers of the Magna Mater also engaged in ecstatic revelry led by eunuch priests who dressed as women and wore ornate women's hairstyles. And worshippers of the goddess Venus? In times of crisis, they would voluntarily demean themselves to appease the goddess by giving offerings of hair. Paul says a woman who prays or prophesies with an uncovered head dishonors her head. Scholars are not agreed what Paul meant by the word head. Was her husband her head? Would such behavior embarrass him? Or was she dishonoring her own head by demeaning herself to appease a god or goddess? Or was she demeaning men in general because man is her true source? With him, she shares the image of God and is his doxa glory. She should not be engaging in a practice which gives honor to gods who created her to be man's curse. So, when Paul tells the Corinthians that it's dishonoring for women to pray or prophesy with an uncovered head, some scholars believe that Paul was confronting the influence of Dionysius worship. They point out that right in this passage, he confronts the Corinthians for getting drunk during worship. Other scholars believe Paul was actually telling lower-class women who were forbidden to cover their heads that they had the same right to cover their heads as women of higher status. Paul goes on to say that women should have authority on their heads because of the angels. What does that mean? First, let's look at what Paul did not say. He did not say that women should have a sign of or a symbol of authority over her head. The words sign of or symbol are not in this passage. Second, he did not say that a woman should have a covering on her head to show that she is under her husband's authority. Some translations translate that, but the New Testament makes no mention of a husband in this passage, and Greek scholars argue that the word authority here always refers to one's own authority, and it can also mean to have control over, liberty, or right. So, what did Paul mean when he said women should have authority on the head because of the angels? First, note that the word angel is the same word as messenger and can refer to a spy. Some scholars believe Paul was concerned about spies who would give the Corinthian church a bad name if women didn't keep their heads under control. But the late theologian Kenneth Bailey, author of Paul Through Mediterranean Eyes, believed that this did refer to angels. He argued the Jewish rabbis taught that creation was such a wonderful event that angels celebrated. And now in this passage, the Holy Spirit has been poured out on all flesh. Both men and women are praying and prophesying and leading worship together. Creation has been restored, and the angels are celebrating. Male and female are ruling together as equal partners. Paul ends his discussion on hair and head coverings telling the Corinthians that women have been given their hair as a covering, and he tells them not to argue about hair and head covering practices because none of the other churches has any such practice. But wait, 3 chapters later in 1 Corinthians 14, doesn't Paul tell women that they must be silent? David Hamilton and Beth Allison Barr argue that this is a quote that Paul is refuting. Barr, in her book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, says Paul is quoting an attitude expressed by the Roman politician Livy and then refuting it. Hamilton and Barr believe the Corinthians had adopted this attitude, and Paul is confronting it. He's quoting it back to them and then using a strong rebuttal word that means nonsense or no way. Unfortunately, the rebuttal word is either absent from most English Bibles or poorly translated with the word or. Hamilton shows that Paul uses this rebuttal word more than a dozen times right in his letter to the Corinthians. So, no, Paul does not tell women that they must remain silent. Instead, he confronts the Corinthians for harboring such a negative attitude. So, to conclude, ancient peoples looked to gods and goddesses as their source of life, provision, and protection. Even though these gods and goddesses had a dim view of men, created women to be a curse, and made Roman men superior to everyone else. And people believed their well-being depended on worshiping the emperor and his gods. But to honor these gods properly, they had to wear the right hairstyle or head covering. But the Apostle Paul tells the Corinthians that followers of Jesus should not engage in pagan hairstyles and head covering practices, because Jesus is the real head, meaning he's our real source of life, provision, protection, and well-being. Because, as Paul tells the Colossians, when we rid ourselves of the attitudes of our earthly nature, our lusts, our greeds, and our malice, and put on our new nature, which is in Christ, we are being renewed in the image of our Creator. Paul describes this in his second letter to the Corinthians as being transformed into God's image with ever-increasing glory.